Horace Greeley, 1811 to 1872, by Clarence Clough Buell. 25 years after his death, Horace Greeley's name remains at the head of the roll of American journalists. Successors in their primacy of current discussion may surpass him, as doubtless some of them already have, in consistency and learning, but hardly in the chief essentials of a journalistic style. Others may exert a more salutary influence, if not so personally diffused, but in the respect of high ideals, courage, intellectual force, and personal magnetism, the qualities which impel a man of letters to be also a man of action, Horace Greeley was of heroic mold. He was no pop-gun journalist firing from a sky sanctum, but a face-to-face champion in the arena of public affairs, laying about him with pen and speech like an ancient Bayard with his sword. The battles he fought for humanity and the blows he gave and received have made him for all time the epic figure of the American press. Born in rural New Hampshire, of English and Scotch-Irish descent, he epitomized his heritage and his attainment in the dedication of his autobiography. To our American boys who, born in poverty, cradled in obscurity, and early called from school to rugged labor, are seeking to convert obstacle into opportunity and wrest achievement from difficulty. Though physically a weak child, his intellect was strong, and when near his 10th year his father removed to Vermont, the boy took with him the reputation of a mental prodigy. So, with little schooling and much reading, he was thought when 14 to be a fit apprentice to a printer, setting forth 4 years later as a journeyman. His parents had moved to western Pennsylvania, and he followed. But after a desultory practice of his art, he came to the metropolis on August 17, 1831, with $10 in his pocket, and so rustic in dress and manners as to fall under suspicion of being a runaway apprentice. Later in life, at least, his face and his figure would have lent distinction to the utmost elegance of style, but his dress was so careless, even after the long period of comparative poverty was past, that the peculiarity became one of his distinguishing features as a public character. And to the last, there were friends of little discernment who thought this eccentricity was studied affectation. But manifestly his dress, like his unkempt handwriting, was the unconscious expression of a spirit so concentrated on the intellectual interests of its life as to be oblivious to mere appearances. After 18 months of dubious success as a journeyman in the city, in his 21st year he joined a friend in setting up a modest printing office, which on March 22, 1834, issued the New Yorker, a literary weekly in the general style of Willis's Mirror, under the firm name of H. Greeley and Company. For 4 years, the young printer showed his editorial aptitude to such good effect that in 1838 he was asked to conduct the Jeffersonian, a Whig campaign paper. This was so effective that in 1840 he was encouraged to edit and publish the Log Cabin, a weekly which gained a circulation of 80,000, brought him reputation as a political writer, and active participation in politics with the Whig leaders, Governor Seward and Thurlow Weed. It contributed much to the election of General Harrison, but very little to the purse of the ambitious editor. On April 10th of the following year, 1841, he issued the first number of the New York Tribune as a Whig daily of independent spirit. He was still editing the New Yorker and the Log Cabin, both of which were soon discontinued, the Weekly Tribune in a way taking their place. Though the New Yorker had brought him literary reputation, it had not been profitable because of uncollectible bills, which at the end amounted to $10,000. Still, at the outset of the Tribune, he was able to count $2,000 to his credit in cash and material. He was then 30 years of age, and for 30 years thereafter the paper grew steadily in circulation, influence, and profit, until a few weeks after his death, a sale of the majority interest indicated that the goodwill of the Tribune, aside from its material and real estate, was held to be worth about $1 million. The Greeley interest was then small, since he had parted with most of it to sustain his generous methods of giving and lending. He had great capacity for literary work, and when absent for travel or business, was a copious contributor to his paper. To his rather delicate physical habit was perhaps due his distaste for all stimulants, alcoholic or otherwise, and his adherence through life to the vegetarian doctrines of Dr. Graham. Another follower of the latter being his wife, Mary Young Chaney, also a writer, whom he married in 1836. His moderate advocacy of temperance in food and drink, coupled with his then unorthodox denial of eternal punishment, helped to identify him in the public mind with most of the isms of the time, including Fourierism and spiritualism, when in fact his mind and his paper were merely open to free inquiry and were active in exposing vagaries of opinion wherever manifested. Protection to American industry and abolitionism were the only varieties which he accepted without qualification, and while the pro-slavery party detested him as a dangerous agitator, it is possible at this day even, from their point of view, to admire the moderation, the candor, and the general humanity of his treatment of the slavery question. In all issues concerning the practical affairs of life, like marriage and divorce, he was guided by rare common sense, and usually his arguments were scholarly and moderate. But in matters of personal controversy he was distinctly human, uniting with a taste for the intellectual fray, a command of facts, and a force and pungency of presentation which never seem admirable in an opponent. He was in great demand as a lecturer and as a speaker at agricultural fairs, his addresses always being distinguished by a desire to be helpful to working humanity and by elevated motives. Though not a jester, genial humor and intellectual exchange were characteristic of his social intercourse. His books, with one or two exceptions, were collections of his addresses and newspaper articles. His first book, Hints Toward Reforms, appeared in 1850 and was followed by Glances at Europe, 1851. A History of the Struggle for Slavery Extension or Restriction, 1856. The Overland Journey to California, 1859, An Address on Success in Business, 1867, Recollections of a Busy Life, formed on a series of articles in the New York Ledger, 1869, Essays Designed to Elucidate the Science of Political Economy, 1870, Letters from Texas and the Lower Mississippi, and an Address to the Farmers of Texas, 1871, What I Know of Farming, 1871, and The American Conflict, written as a book, the first volume appearing in 1864 and the second in 1867. This work on the Civil War is remarkable when considered in the light of his purpose to show the inevitable sequence whereby ideas proved the germ of events. But it was hastily prepared, and while strikingly accurate in the large sense, will not bear scrutiny in some of the minor details of war history. Neither his political friends nor his party, nor the causes he espoused, could hold him to a course of partisan loyalty contrary to his own convictions of right and duty. As a member of the Seward-Weed-Greeley triumvirate, he was often a thorn in the flesh of the senior members. His letter of November 11th, 1854, dissolving the political firm, being one of the frankest documents in the history of American politics. During the Civil War, he occasionally embarrassed Mr. Lincoln's administration by what seemed then to be untimely cries of "on to Richmond," immediate emancipation, and peace. On the whole, his influence for the Union cause was powerful, but when, the war being over, he advocated general amnesty, and finally, as an object lesson when on the bail bond of Jefferson Davis, he lost the support of a large body of his most ardent anti-slavery admirers. The clamor against him called forth a characteristic defiance in his letter to members of the Union League Club who were seeking to discipline him. Having further alienated the Republican Party by his general attitude in Reconstruction matters, he became the logical candidate for the presidency in 1872, of the Democrats at Baltimore and the liberal Republicans at Cincinnati, in opposition to a second term for General Grant. Though personally he made a brilliant canvass, the influences at work in his favor were inharmonious and disintegrating, and the result was the most humiliating defeat. This he appeared to bear with mental buoyancy, despite the affliction of his wife's death, which occurred a week before the election, he having left the stump in September to watch unremittingly at her bedside. On November 6th, the day after his defeat, he resumed the editorship of the Tribune, which 6 months before he had relinquished to Whitlaw Reid. Thereafter he contributed to only 4 issues of the paper, for the strain of his domestic and political misfortunes had aggravated his tendency to insomnia. On the 12th he was seriously ill, and on the 29th he succumbed to inflammation of the brain. The last few months of his eventful career supplied most of the elements essential to a Greek tragedy. On December 23rd, the Tribune, having been reorganized with Mr. Reid in permanent control, there first appeared at the head of the editorial page the line, "Founded by Horace Greeley," as a memorial to the great journalist and reformer. A bronze statue has been erected in the portal of the new Tribune office, and another statue in the angle made by Broadway and 6th Avenue, appropriately named Greeley Square, after the man who was second to no other citizen in establishing the intellectual ascendancy of the metropolis. Clarence Clough Buell. The United States just after the Revolution. From The American Conflict, reprinted by permission of O.D. Case & Company, Publishers, Hartford, Connecticut. The difficulties which surrounded the infancy and impeded the growth of the 13 original or Atlantic states were less formidable, but kindred and not less real. Our fathers emerged from their arduous, protracted, desolating revolutionary struggle, rich indeed in hope, but poor in worldly goods. Their country had for 7 years been traversed and wasted by contending armies, almost from end to end. Cities and villages had been laid in ashes, habitations had been deserted and left to decay. Farms, stripped of their fences and deserted by their owners, had for years produced only weeds. Camp fevers, with the hardships and privations of war, had destroyed many more than the sword, and all alike had been subtracted from the most effective and valuable part of a population always, as yet, quite inadequate. Cripples and invalids, melancholy mementos of the yet recent struggle, abounded in every village and township. Habits of industry had been unsettled and destroyed by the anxieties and uncertainties of war. The gold and silver of anti-revolutionary days had crossed the ocean in exchange for arms and munitions. The Continental paper, which for a time more than supplied, in volume, its place, had become utterly worthless. In the absence of a tariff, which the Confederate Congress lacked power to impose, our ports, immediately after peace, were glutted with foreign luxuries, gewgaws which our people were eager enough to buy, but for which they soon found themselves utterly unable to pay. They were almost exclusively an agricultural people, and their products, save only tobacco and indigo, were not wanted by the Old World, and found but a very restricted and inconsiderable market even in the West Indies, whose trade was closely monopolized by the nations to which they respectively belonged. Indian corn and potatoes, the 2 principal edibles for which the poor of the Old World are largely indebted to America, were consumed to a very limited extent, and not at all imported by the people of the Eastern Hemisphere. The wheat-producing capacity of our soil, at first unsurpassed, was soon exhausted by the unskillful and thriftless cultivation of the 18th century. Though 1/3 of the labor of the country was probably devoted to the cutting of timber, the axe helve was but a pudding stick, while the plow was a rude structure of wood, clumsily pointed and shielded with iron. 1,000 bushels of corn, maize, are now grown in our western prairies at a cost of fewer days' labor than were required for the production of 100 in New York or New England 80 years ago. and though the settlements of that day were nearly all within 100 miles of tidewater, the cost of transporting bulky staples for even that distance over the execrable roads that then existed was about equal to the present charge for transportation from Illinois to New York. Industry was paralyzed by the absence or uncertainty of markets. Idleness tempted to dissipation, of which the tumult and excitement of civil war had long been the school. Unquestionably, the moral condition of our people had sadly deteriorated through the course of the Revolution. Intemperance had extended its ravages, profanity and licentiousness had overspread the land. A coarse and scoffing infidelity had become fashionable, even in high quarters, and the letters of Washington and his compatriots bear testimony to the widespread prevalence of venality and corruption, even while the great issue of independence or subjugation was still undecided. The return of peace, though it arrested the calamities, the miseries, and the desolations of war, was far from ushering in that halcyon state of universal prosperity and happiness which had been fondly and sanguinely anticipated. Thousands were suddenly deprived by it of their accustomed employment and means of subsistence, and were unable at once to replace them. Those accepted, though precarious, avenues to fame and fortune in which they had found at least competence were instantly closed, and no new ones seemed to open before them. In the absence of aught that could with justice be termed a currency, trade and business were even more depressed than industry. Commerce and navigation, unfettered by legislative restriction, ought to have been, or ought soon to have become, more flourishing, if the dicta of the world's accepted political economists had been sound, but the facts were deplorably at variance with their inculcations. Trade, emancipated from the vexatious trammels of the custom-house barker and gauger, fell tangled and prostrate in the toils of the usurer and the sheriff. The common people, writhing under the intolerable pressure of debt for which no means of payment existed, were continually prompting their legislators to authorize and direct those baseless issues of irredeemable paper money by which a temporary relief is achieved at the cost of more pervading and less curable disorders. In the year 1786, the legislature of New Hampshire, then sitting at Exeter, was surrounded, evidently by preconcert, by a gathering of angry and desperate men intent on overawing it into an authorization of such an issue. In 1786, the famous Shays Insurrection occurred in western Massachusetts, wherein 1,500 men, stung to madness by the snow shower of writs to which they could not respond and executions which they had no means of satisfying, undertook to relieve themselves from intolerable infestation and save their families from being turned into the highways by dispersing the courts and arresting the enforcement of legal process altogether. That the seaboard cities, depending entirely on foreign commerce, neither manufacturing themselves nor having any other than foreign fabrics to dispose of, should participate in the general suffering and earnestly scan the political and social horizon in quest of sources and conditions of comprehensive and enduring relief, was inevitable. And thus industrial paralysis, commercial embarrassment, and political disorder combined to overbear inveterate prejudice, sectional jealousy, and the ambition of local magnates in creating that more perfect union whereof the foundations were laid and pillars erected by Washington, Hamilton, Franklin, Madison, and their compeers in the convention which framed the federal Constitution. Yet it would not be just to close this hasty and casual glance at our country under the old Federation without noting some features which tend to relieve the darkness of the picture. The abundance and excellence of the timber, which still covered at least two-thirds of the area of the then states, enabled the common people to supply themselves with habitations which, however rude and uncomely, were more substantial and comfortable than those possessed by the masses of any other country on earth. The luxuriant and omnipresent forests were likewise the sources of cheap and ample supplies of fuel, whereby the severity of our northern winters was mitigated, and the warm, bright fireside of even the humblest family in the long winter evenings of our latitude rendered centers of cheer and enjoyment. Social intercourse was more general, less formal, more hearty, more valued than at present. Friendships were warmer and deeper. Relationship, by blood or by marriage, was more profoundly regarded. Men were not ashamed to own that they loved their cousins better than their other neighbors, and their neighbors better than the rest of mankind. To spend a month in the dead of winter in a visit to the dear old homestead, and in interchanges of affectionate greetings with brothers and sisters married and settled at distances of 20 to 50 miles apart, was not deemed an absolute waste of time, nor even an experiment in fraternal civility and hospitality. And though cultivation was far less effective than now, it must not be inferred that food was scanty or hunger predominant. The woods were alive with game, and nearly every boy and man between 15 and 60 years of age was a hunter. The larger and smaller rivers, as yet unobstructed by the dams and wheels of the cotton spinner and power loom weaver, abounded in excellent fish, and at seasons fairly swarmed with them. The potato, usually planted in the vegetable mold left by recently exterminated forests, yielded its edible tubers with a bounteous profusion unknown to the husbandry of our day. Hills, the most granitic and apparently sterile, from which the wood was burned one season, would the next year produce any grain in ample measure, and at a moderate cost of labor and care. Almost every farmer's house was a hive, wherein the great wheel and the little wheel, the former kept in motion by the hands and feet of all the daughters, 10 years old and upward, the latter plied by their not less industrious mother, hummed and whirred from morning till night. In the back room, or some convenient appendage, the loom responded day by day to the movements of the busy shuttle, whereby the fleeces of the farmer's flock and the flax of his field were slowly but steadily converted into substantial, though homely cloth, sufficient for the annual wear of the family, and often with something over to exchange at the neighboring merchants for his groceries and wares. A few bushels of corn, a few sheep, a fattened steer, with perhaps a few saw logs or loads of hoop poles made up the annual surplus of the husbandman's products, helping to square accounts with the blacksmith, the wheelwright, the minister, and the lawyer, if the farmer was so unfortunate as to have any dealings with the latter personage. His life during peace was passed in a narrower round than ours, and may well seem to us tame, limited, monotonous, but the sun which warmed him was identical with ours, the breezes which refreshed him were like those we gladly welcome, and while his roads to mill and to meeting were longer and rougher than those we daily traverse, he doubtless passed them unvexed by apprehensions of a snorting locomotive, at least as contented as we, and with small suspicion of his ill fortune in having been born in the 18th instead of the 19th century. The illusion that the times that were are better than those that are has probably pervaded all ages, yet a passionately earnest assertion, which many of us have heard from the lips of the old men of 30 to 50 years ago, that the days of their youth were sweeter and happier than those we have known, will doubtless justify us in believing that they were by no means intolerable. It is not too much to assume that the men by whose valor and virtue American independence was achieved, and who lived to enjoy for half a century thereafter the gratitude of their country and the honest pride of their children, saw wealth as fairly distributed and the labor of freemen as adequately rewarded as those of almost any other country or of any previous generation. Political compromises and political log rolling. From the American Conflict, reprinted by permission of O.D. Case and Company, publishers, Hartford, Connecticut. Political compromises, though they have been rendered unsavory by abuse, are a necessary incident of mixed or balanced governments, that is, of all but simple, unchecked despotisms. Wherever liberty exists, there diversities of judgment will be developed, and unless one will dominates over all others, a practical mean between widely differing convictions must sometimes be sought. If, for example, a legislature is composed of two distinct bodies or houses, and they differ, as they occasionally will, with regard to the propriety or the amount of an appropriation required for a certain purpose, and neither is disposed to give way, a partial concession on either hand is often the most feasible mode of practical adjustment. Where the object contemplated is novel or non-essential to the general efficiency of the public service, such as the construction of a new railroad, canal, or other public work, the repugnance of either house should suffice entirely to defeat or at least to postpone it, for neither branch has a right to exact from the other conformity with its views on a disputed point as the price of its own concurrence in measures essential to the existence of the government. The attempt, therefore, of the Senate of February-March 1849 to dictate to the House, "You shall consent to such an organization of the territories as we prescribe, or we will defeat the civil appropriation bill, and thus derange, if not arrest, the most vital machinery of the government," was utterly unjustifiable. Yet this should not blind us to the fact that differences of opinion are at times developed on questions of decided moment, where the rights of each party are equal, and where an ultimate concurrence in one common line of action is essential. Without some deference to adverse convictions, no confederation of the insurgent colonies was attainable. No union of the states could have been effected. And where the executive is, by according him the veto, clothed with a limited power over the making of laws, it is inevitable that some deference to his views, his convictions, should be evinced by those who fashion and mature those laws. Under this aspect, compromise in government is sometimes indispensable and laudable. But what is known in state legislation as log rolling is quite another matter. A has a bill which he is intent on passing, but which has no intrinsic worth that commends it to his fellow members. But B, C, and D, and the residue of the alphabet, have each his little bill, not perhaps specially obnoxious or objectionable, but such as could not be passed on its naked merits. All alike must fail, unless carried by that reciprocity of support suggested by their common need and peril. An understanding is effected between their several backers, so that A votes for the bills of B, C, D, etc., as the indispensable means of securing the passage of his own darling. And thus a whole litter of bills become laws, whereof no single one was demanded by the public interest, or could have passed without the aid of others as unworthy as itself. Such is substantially the process whereby our statute books are loaded with acts which subserve no end but to fill the pockets of the few at the expense of the rights or the interests of the many.
Dean Stanley, on reading one of Greene's first literary productions, said, "I see you are in danger of becoming picturesque. Beware of it. I have suffered from it." Though Greene was then at an age when advice from such a source might well have had some influence, his natural bent was even then too strong to be affected by the warning. Born in Oxford in 1837, he entered Jesus College, where he showed the same remarkable power of reconstructing the life of the past that marked his historical writings in after years, and where his preference for historical chronicles over the classics and his lack of verbal memory puzzled his tutor and prevented his winning a special distinction in the studies of his college course. On graduating in 1859, he entered the church, and in 1866 became vicar of Stepney in East London. Here, besides preaching and visiting, he was a leader in the movement for improving the condition of the East Side, and in the organization of an effective system of charitable relief, nearly the whole of his meager income being expended on his parish. He was obliged to make up the deficit by writing articles for the Saturday Review. These were mainly brief historical reviews and essays, but some were of a light character, dealing with social topics. Hastily written, but incisive and original, many of them had permanent value, and they were amended and published in a separate volume under the title of Stray Studies in England and Italy, after his Short History of the English People had made him famous. His health was fast breaking under the strain of his parish work, and this, combined with the growing spirit of skepticism, induced him to withdraw from active clerical work and accept an appointment as librarian at Lambeth, where he was able to give much of his time to historical study. He had at first planned a treatise on the Angevin kings, but was urged by his friends to undertake something of wider scope and of more general interest. Accordingly, he set to work on a short history of the English people. The task before him was difficult. He wished to make a book that would entertain the general reader, and at the same time be suggestive and instructive to the scholar, and to compress it all within the limits of an outline, a term usually associated with those bare, crabbed summaries which are sometimes inflicted by teachers upon the young and defenseless, but are avoided by general reader and scholar alike. How far he succeeded appears from the fact that, with the exception of Macaulay's work, no treatise on English history has ever met with such prompt and complete success among all classes of readers. The vivid, picturesque style made it exceedingly popular, while the originality of method and of interpretation won for it the praise of men like Freeman and Stubbs. As to its accuracy, there is some difference of opinion. When the book first came out, 1874, sharp reviewers caught the historian in many slips, usually of a kind not to affect his general conclusions, but serious enough to injure his reputation for accuracy. Most of these errors were corrected in later editions, and are not to be found in the longer History of the English People 4 volumes, which contains the material of the earlier work in an expanded, but as some think, in a less interesting form. His next work was in a field in which none could refuse him credit for original research, The Making of England, dealing with the early part of the Anglo-Saxon period and the conquest of England, which carried the narrative down to 1052, show extraordinary skill in handling the scanty historical materials of those times. He was at work on the Conquest at the time of his death, which occurred in 1883. During the last years of his life, his illness had frequently interrupted his work, and but for the aid of his wife in historical research, as well as the mechanical labor of amanuensis, he would not have accomplished what he did. As it is, his friends regard his actual achievements as slight compared to what his talents promised had he lived. Still, these achievements entitle him to a high place among modern historians. In accuracy he has many superiors, but in brilliancy of style and human sympathy, and above all, in the power to make the past, present, and real, he has few equals. Fiction, he once said, is history that didn't happen. His own books have the interest of novels without departing in essentials from the truth. Besides writing the works above mentioned, he issued a selection of Readings from English History, 1879, and wrote with his wife a short geography of the British Isles, 1881. The Battle of Hastings, from History of the English People. On the 14th of October, William led his men at dawn along the higher ground that leads from Hastings to the battlefield which Harold had chosen. From the mound of Telham, the Normans saw the host of the English gathered thickly behind a rough trench and a stockade on the height of Selkirk. Marshy ground covered their right. On the left, the most exposed part of the position, the huscarls, or bodyguard of Harold, men in full armor and wielding huge axes, were grouped round the golden dragon of Wessex and the standard of the king. The rest of the ground was covered by thick masses of half-armed rustics who had flocked at Harold's summons to the fight with the stranger. It was against the center of this formidable position that William arrayed his Norman knighthood, while the mercenary forces he had gathered in France and Brittany were ordered to attack its flanks. A general charge of the Norman foot opened the battle. In front rode the minstrel Taillefer, tossing his sword in the air and catching it again, while he chanted the song of Roland. He was the first of the host who struck a blow, and he was the first to fall. The charge broke vainly on the stout stockade, behind which the English warriors plied axe and javelin with fierce cries of "Out! Out!" and the repulse of the Norman footmen was followed by a repulse of the Norman horse. Again and again the Duke rallied and led them to the fatal stockade. All the fury of fight that glowed in the Norseman's blood, all the headlong valor that spurred him over the slopes of valley duns, mingled that day with the coolness of head, the dogged perseverance, the inexhaustible faculty of resource, which shone at Mortimer and Varaville. His Breton troops, entangled in the marshy ground on his left, broke in disorder, and as panic spread through the army, a cry arose that the Duke was slain. William tore off his helmet. "I live," he shouted, "and by God's help I will conquer yet." Maddened by a fresh repulse, the Duke spurred right at the standard. Unhorsed, his terrible mace struck down Gurth, the king's brother. Again dismounted, a blow from his hand hurled to the ground an unmannerly rider who would not lend him his steed. Amidst the roar and tumult of the battle, he turned the flight he had arrested into the means of victory. Broken as the stockade was by his desperate onset, the shield wall of the warriors behind it still held the Normans at bay, till William, by a feint of flight, drew a part of the English force from their post of vantage. Turning on his disorderly pursuers, the Duke cut them to pieces, broke through the abandoned line, and made himself master of the central ground. Meanwhile, the French and Bretons made good their ascent on either flank. At 3, the hill seemed won. At 6, the fight still raged around the standard, where Harold's huscarls stood stubbornly at bay on a spot marked afterward by the high altar of Battle Abbey. An order from the Duke at last brought his archers to the front. Their arrow flight told heavily on the dense masses crowded around the king, and as the sun went down, a shaft pierced Harold's right eye. He fell between the royal ensigns, and the battle closed with a desperate melee over his corpse. The Rising of the Baronage against King John, from History of the English People. The open resistance of the northern barons nerved the rest of their order to action. The great houses, who had cast away their older, feudal traditions for a more national policy, were drawn by the crisis into close union with the families which had sprung from the ministers and councillors of the two Henrys. To the first group belonged such men as Sayer de Quincey, the Earl of Winchester, Geoffrey of Mandeville, Earl of Essex, the Earl of Clare, Fulk Fitzwarren, William Mallet, the House of Fitzalan and Gant. Among the second group were Henry Bowen and Roger Bigod, the Earls of Hereford and Norfolk, the younger William Marshall and Robert de Vere. Robert Fitzwalter, who took the command of their united force, represented both parties equally, but he was sprung from the Norman house of Brionne, while the justiciar of Henry II, Richard de Lucy, had been his grandfather. Secretly and on the pretext of pilgrimage, these nobles met at St. Edmundsbury, resolute to bear no longer with John's delays. If he refused to restore their liberties, they swore to make war on him, till he confirmed them by charter under the king's seal, and they parted to raise forces with the purpose of presenting their demands at Christmas. John, knowing nothing of the coming storm, pursued his policy of winning over the church by granting it freedom of election, while he embittered still more the strife with his nobles by demanding scutage from the northern nobles who had refused to follow him to Poynton. But the barons were now ready to act, and early in January in the memorable year of 1215, they appeared in arms to lay, as they had planned, their demands before the king. John was taken by surprise. He had asked for a truce till Eastertide and spent the interval in fevered efforts to avoid the blow. Again he offered freedom to the church and took vows as a crusader against whom war was a sacrilege, while he called for a general oath of allegiance and fealty from the whole body of his subjects. But month after month only showed the king the uselessness of further resistance. Though Paldulf was with him, his vassalage had as yet brought little fruit in the way of aid from Rome. The commissioners whom he sent to plead his cause at the shire courts brought back news that no man would help him against the charter that the barons claimed, and his efforts to detach the clergy from the league of his opponents utterly failed. The nation was against the king. He was far, indeed, from being utterly deserted. His ministers still clung to him. But cling as such men might to John, they clung to him rather as mediators than adherents. Their sympathies went with the demands of the barons when the delay which had been granted was over, and the nobles again gathered in arms at Brackley in Northamptonshire to lay their claims before the king. Nothing marks more strongly the absolutely despotic idea of his sovereignty, which John had formed, than the passionate surprise which breaks out in his reply. "Why do they not ask for my kingdom?" he cried. "I will never grant such liberties as will make me a slave." The imperialist theories of the lawyers of his father's court had done their work. Held at bay by the practical sense of Henry, they had told on the more headstrong nature of his sons. Richard and John both held with Glanville that the will of the prince was the law of the land, and to fetter that will by the customs and franchises which were more embodied in the baron's claims seemed to John a monstrous usurpation of his rights. But no imperialist theories had touched the minds of his people. The country rose as one man at his refusal. At the close of May, London threw open the gates to the forces of the barons, now arrayed under Robert Fitzwalter as Marshal of the Army of God and Holy Church. Exeter and Lincoln followed the example of the capital. Promises of aid came from Scotland and Wales. The northern barons marched hastily under Eustace de Vesci to join their comrades in London. Even the nobles who had as yet clung to the king, but whose hopes of conciliation were blasted by his obstinacy, yielded at last to the summons of the army of God. Pandulf, indeed, and Archbishop Langton still remained with John, but they counseled, as Earl Ranulph and William Marshall counseled, his acceptance of the charter. None, in fact, counseled its rejection save his new justiciar, the Poitevin Peter de Roche, and other foreigners who knew the barons purposed driving them from the land. But even the number of these was small. There was a moment when John found himself with but 7 knights at his back, and before him a nation in arms. Quick as he was, he had been taken utterly by surprise. It was in vain that in the short respite he had gained from Christmas to Easter, he had summoned mercenaries to his aid and appealed to his new suzerain, the Pope. Summons and appeal were alike too late. Nursing wrath in his heart, John bowed to necessity and called the barons to a conference on an island in the Thames, between Windsor and Staines, near a marshy meadow by the riverside, the meadow of Runnymede. The king encamped on one bank of the river. The barons covered the flat of Runnymede on the other. Their delegates met on the 15th of July on the island between them, but the negotiations were a mere cloak to cover John's purpose of unconditional submission. The Great Charter was discussed and agreed to in a single day. Copies of it were made and sent for preservation to the cathedrals and churches, and one copy may still be seen in the British Museum, injured by age and fire, but with the royal seal still hanging from the brown shriveled parchment. It is impossible to gaze without reverence on the earliest monument of English freedom which we can see with our own eyes and touch with our own hands, the Great Charter, to which from age to age men have looked back as the groundwork of English liberty. But in itself the charter was no novelty, nor did it claim to establish any new constitutional principles. The charter of Henry I formed the basis of the whole, and the additions to it, for the most part, formal recognitions of the judicial and administrative changes introduced by Henry II. What was new in it was its origin. In form, like the charter on which it was based, it was nothing but a royal grant. In actual fact, it was a treaty between the whole English people and its king. In it, England found itself for the first time since the conquest a nation bound together by common national interest, by a common national sympathy. In words which almost close the charter, the community of the whole land is recognized as the great body from which the restraining power of the baronage takes its validity. There is no distinction of blood or class, of Norman or not Norman, of noble or not noble. All are recognized as Englishmen. The rights of all are owned as English rights. Bishops and nobles claimed and secured at Runnymede the rights not of baron and churchman only, but those of freeholder and merchant, of townsman and villein. The provisions against wrong and extortion, which the barons drew up as against the king for themselves, they drew up as against themselves for their tenants. Based too as it is professed to be on Henry's charter, it was far from being a mere copy of what had gone before. The vague expressions of the old charter were now exchanged for precise and elaborate provisions. The bonds of unwritten custom, which the older grant did little more than recognize, had proved too weak to hold the Angevins, and the baronage set them aside for the restraints of written and defined law. It is in this way that the Great Charter marks the transition from the age of traditional rights, preserved in the nation's memory and officially declared by the primate, to the age of written legislation, of parliaments and statutes, which was to come. Its opening, indeed, is in general terms. The Church had shown its power of self-defense in the struggle of the interdict, and the clause which recognized its rights alone retained the older and general form. But all vagueness ceases when the Charter passes on to deal with the rights of Englishmen at large, their right to justice, to security of person and property, to good government. No freeman, ran a memorable article that lies at the base of our whole judicial system, shall be seized or imprisoned, or dispossessed or outlawed, or in any way brought to ruin. We will not go against any man nor send against him, save by legal judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. To no man will we sell, rents another, or deny or delay right or justice. The great reforms of the past reigns were now formally recognized. Judges of assize were to hold their circuits 4 times in the year, and the king's court was no longer to follow the king in his wanderings over the realm, but to sit in a fixed place. But the denial of justice unto John was a small danger compared with the lawless exactions both of himself and his predecessor. Richard had increased the amount of the scutage which Henry II had introduced, and applied it to raise funds for his ransom. He had restored the Danegeld, or land tax, so often abolished, under the new name of cuircage, had seized the wool of the Cistercians and the plate of the churches, and raided movables as well as land. John had again raised the rate of scutage, and imposed aids, fines, and ransoms at his pleasure, without counsel of the baronage. The Great Charter met this abuse by a provision on which our constitutional system rests. No scutage or aid, other than the 3 customary feudal aids, shall be imposed in our realm, save by the common council of the realm. And to this great council was provided that prelates and the greater barons should be summoned by special writ, and all tenants in chief through the sheriffs and bailiffs at least 40 days before. The provision defined what had probably been the common usage of the realm, but the definition turned it into a national right, a right so momentous that on it rests our whole parliamentary life. Even the baronage seemed to have been startled when they realized the extent of their claim, and the provision was dropped from the later issue of the charter at the outset of the next reign. But the clause brought home to the nation at large the possession of a right which became dearer as years went by. More and more clearly the nation discovered that in these simple words lay the secret of political power. It was the right of self-taxation that England fought for under Earl Simon as she fought for it under Hampden. It was the establishment of this right which established English freedom. And England's growth in commerce and comfort under Elizabeth. From History of the English People. A middle class of wealthier landowners and merchants was fast rising in importance. The wealth of the meaner sort, wrote one to Cecil, is the very fount of rebellion, the occasion of their indolence, of the contempt of the nobility, and of the hatred they have conceived against them. But Cecil and his mistress could watch the upgrowth of national wealth with cooler eyes. In the country its effect was to undo much of the evil which the diminution of small holdings had done, whatever social embarrassment it might bring about. The revolution in agriculture which Latimer deplored undoubtedly favored production. Not only was a larger capital brought to bear upon the land, but the mere change in the system of cultivation introduced a taste for new and better modes of farming. The breed of horses and of cattle was improved, and a far greater use made of manure and dressings. 1 acre under the new system produced, it was said, as much as 2 under the old. As a more careful and constant cultivation was introduced, a greater number of hands came to be required on every farm, and much of the surplus labor which had been flung off the land in the commencement of the new system was thus recalled to it. And yet more efficient agency in absorbing the unemployed was found in the development of manufactures. The linen trade was as yet of small value, and that of silk weaving was only just introduced. But the woolen manufacture was fast becoming an important element in the national wealth. England no longer sent her fleeces to be woven in Flanders and to be dyed at Florence. The spinning of yarn, the weaving, fulling, and dyeing of cloth were spreading rapidly from the towns over the countryside. The worsted trade, of which Norwich was the center, extended over the whole of the eastern counties. Farmers' wives began everywhere to spin their wool from their own sheep's backs into a coarse homespun. The south and west, however, still remained the great seats of industry and of wealth, for they were the homes of mining and manufacturing activity. The iron manufactures were limited to Kent and Sussex, though their prosperity in this quarter was already threatened by the growing scarcity of the wood which fed their furnaces, and by the exhaustion of the forests of the Weald. Cornwall was then, as now, the sole exporter of tin, and the exportation of its copper was just beginning. The broadcloths of the West claimed the palm among the woolen stuffs of England. The Cinque Ports held almost a monopoly of the commerce of the Channel. Every little harbor from the foreland to the Land's End sent out its fleets of fishing boats, manned with bold seamen who were to furnish crews for Drake and the buccaneers. Northern England still lagged far behind the rest of the realm in its industrial activity. But in the reign of Elizabeth, the poverty and inaction to which it had been doomed for so many centuries began at last to be broken. We see the first sign of the revolution which has transferred English manufactures and English wealth to the north of the Mersey and of the Humber, in the mention which now meets us of the friezes of Manchester, the coverlets of York, the cutlery of Sheffield, and the cloth trade of Halifax. Elizabeth lent a ready patronage to the new commerce. She shared in its speculations. She considered its extension and protection as part of public policy, and she sanctioned the formation of the great merchant companies which could alone secure the trader against wrong or injustice in distant countries. the Merchant Adventurers of London, a body which had existed long before and had received a charter of incorporation under Henry VII, furnished a model for the Russia Company and the company which absorbed the new commerce to the Indies. But it was not wholly with satisfaction that either the Queen or her ministers watched the social change which wealth was producing around them. They feared the increased expenditure and comfort which necessarily followed it, as likely to impoverish the land and to eat out the hardihood of the people. England spendeth more on wines in 1 year, complained Cecil, than it did in ancient times in 4 years. In the upper classes, the lavishness of a new wealth combined with the lavishness of life, a love of beauty, of color, of display, to revolutionize English dress. Men wore a mantle on their backs. The Queen's 3,000 robes were rivaled in their bravery by the slashed velvets, the ruffs, the jeweled purpoints of the courtiers around her. But signs of the growing wealth were as evident in the lower class as in the higher. The disuse of salt fish and the greater consumption of meat marked the improvement which had taken place among the country folk. Their rough and wattled farmhouses were being superseded by dwellings of brick and stone. Pewter was replacing the wooden trenchers of the early yeomanry, and there were yeomen who could boast of a fair show of silver plate. It is from this period, indeed, that we can first date the rise of a conception which seems to us now a peculiarly English one, the conception of domestic comfort. The chimney corner, so closely associated with family life, came into existence with the general introduction of chimneys, a feature rare in ordinary houses at the beginning of this reign. Pillows, which had before been despised by the farmer and the trader as fit only for women in childbed, were now in general use. Carpets superseded the filthy flooring of rushes. The loftier houses of the wealthier merchants, their parapeted fronts and costly wainscoting, their cumbrous but elaborate beds, their carved staircases, their quaintly figured gables, not only contrasted with the squalor which had till then characterized English towns, but marked the rise of a new middle class which was to play its part in later history. A transformation of an even more striking kind marked the extinction of the feudal character of the noblesse. Gloomy walls and serried battlements disappeared from the dwellings of the gentry. The strength of the medieval fortress gave way to the pomp and grace of the Elizabethan hall. Knowle, Longfleet, Burleigh, and Hatfield, Hardwicke, and Audley End are familiar instances of a social as well as an architectural change, which covered England with buildings where the thought of defense was abandoned for that of domestic comfort and refinement. We still gaze with pleasure on their picturesque line of gables, their fretted fronts, their gilded turrets and fanciful vanes, their castellated gateways, the jutting oriels from which the great noble looked down on his new Italian garden, on its stately terraces and broad flights of steps, its vases and fountains, its quaint mazes, its formal walks, its lines of yews cut into grotesque shapes in hopeless rivalry of the cypress avenues of the south. Nor was the change less within than without. The life of the Middle Ages concentrated itself in the vast castle hall, where the baron looked from his upper dais on the retainers who gathered at his board. But the great households were fast breaking up, and the whole feudal economy disappeared when the lord of the household withdrew with his family into his parlor, or withdrawing room, and left the hall to his dependents. The Italian refinement of life, which told on pleasance and garden told on the remodeling of the house within, raised the principal apartments to an upper floor, a change to which we owe the grand staircases of the time, surrounded the quiet courts by long galleries of the presence, crowned in rude hearth with huge chimney pieces adorned with fawns and cupids, with quaintly interlaced monograms and fantastic arabesques, hung tapestries on the walls, and crowded each chamber with quaintly carved chairs and costly cabinets. The prodigal use of glass became a marked feature in the domestic architecture of the time, and one whose influence on the general health of the people can hardly be overrated. Long lines of windows stretched over the fronts of the new manor halls. Every merchant's house had its oriel. You shall have sometimes, Lord Bacon grumbled, your house is so full of glass that we cannot tell where to come to be out of the sun or the cold. What Elizabeth contributed to this upgrowth of national prosperity was the peace and social order from which it sprang. While auto de fe were blazing at Rome and Madrid, while the Inquisition was driving the sober traders of the Netherlands to madness, while Scotland was tossing with religious strife, while the policy of Catherine secured for France but a brief respite from the horrors of civil war, England remained untroubled and at peace. Religious order was little disturbed. Recusants were few. There was little cry as yet for freedom of worship. Freedom of conscience was the right of every man. Persecution had ceased. It was only as the tale of a darker past that men recalled how, 10 years back, heretics had been sent to the fire. Civil order was even more profound than religious order. The failure of the Northern Revolt proved the political tranquility of the country. The social troubles from vagrancy and evictions were slowly passing away. Taxation was light. The country was firmly and steadily governed. The popular favor which had met Elizabeth at her accession was growing into a passionate devotion. Of her faults, indeed, England, beyond the circle of her court, knew little or nothing. The shiftings of her diplomacy were never seen outside the royal closet. The nation at large could only judge her foreign policy by its main outlines, by its temperance and good sense, and above all, by its success. But every Englishman was able to judge Elizabeth in her rule at home, in her love of peace, her instinct of order, the firmness and moderation of her government, the judicious spirit of conciliation and compromise among warring factions, which gave the country an unexampled tranquility at a time when almost every other country in Europe was torn with civil war. Every sign of the growing prosperity, the sight of London as it became the mart of the world, of stately mansions as they rose on every manor, told, and justly told, in the Queen's favor. Her statue in the center of the London Exchange was a tribute on the part of the merchant class to the interest with which she watched and shared personally in its enterprises. Her thrift won a general gratitude. The memories of the terror and of the martyrs threw into bright relief the aversion from bloodshed, which was conspicuous in her earlier reign, and never wholly wanting through its fiercer glows. Above all, there was a general confidence in her instinctive knowledge of the national temper. Her finger was always on the public pulse. She knew exactly when she could resist the feeling of her people, and when she must give way before the new sentiment of freedom which her policy unconsciously fostered. But when she retreated, her defeat had all the grace of victory, and the frankness and unreserve of her surrender won back at once the love that her resistance lost. Her attitude at home, in fact, was that of a woman whose pride in the well-being of her subjects and whose longing for their favor was the one warm touch in the coldness of her natural temper. If Elizabeth could be said to love anything, she loved England. Nothing, she said to her first Parliament, in words of unwonted fire, nothing, no worldly thing under the sun is so dear to me as the love and goodwill of my subjects, and the love and goodwill which were so dear to her, she fully won. William Pitt, from History of the English People. Out of the union of these two strangely contrasted leaders, in fact, rose the greatest, as it was the last, of the purely Whig administrations, but its real power lay from beginning to end in Pitt himself. Poor as he was, for his income was little more than $200 a year, and springing as he did from a family of no political importance, it was by sheer dint of genius that the young cornet of horse, at whose youth and inexperience Walpole had sneered, seized a power which the Whig houses had ever since the Revolution kept in their grasp. The real significance of his entry into the ministry was that the national opinion entered with him. He had no strength save from his popularity, but this popularity showed that the political torpor of the nation was passing away, and that a new interest in public affairs and a resolve to have weight in them was becoming felt in the nation at large. It was by the same instinct of a great people that this interest and resolve gathered themselves round William Pitt. If he was ambitious, his ambition had no petty aim. "I want to call England," he said as he took office, "out of that enervate state in which 20,000 men from France can shake her." His call was soon answered. He at once breathed his own lofty spirit into the country he served, as he communicated something of his own grandeur to the men who served him. "No man," said a soldier of the time, "ever entered Mr. Pitt's closet who did not feel himself braver when he came out than when he went in." Ill combined as were his earlier expeditions, and many as were his failures, he roused a temper in the nation at large which made ultimate defeat impossible. "England has been a long time in labor," exclaimed Frederick of Prussia as he recognized a greatness like his own, "but she has at last brought forth a man." It is this personal and solitary grandeur which strikes us most as we look back to William Pitt. The tone of his speech and action stands out in utter contrast with the tone of his time. In the midst of a society critical, polite, indifferent, simple even to the affectation of simplicity, witty and amusing but absolutely prosaic, cool of heart and of head, skeptical of virtue and enthusiasm, skeptical above all of itself, Pitt stood absolutely alone. The depth of his conviction, his passionate love for all that he deemed lofty and true, his fiery energy, his poetic imaginativeness, his theatrical airs and rhetoric, his haughty self-assumption, his pompousness and extravagance were not more puzzling to his contemporaries than the confidence with which he appealed to the higher sentiments of mankind, the scorn with which he turned from a corruption which had till then been the great engine of politics, the undoubting faith which he felt in himself, in the grandeur of his aims, and in his power to carry them out. "I know that I can save the country," he said to the Duke of Devonshire on his entry into the ministry, "and I know no other man can." The groundwork of Pitt's character was an intense and passionate pride, but it was a pride which kept him from stooping to the level of the men who had so long held England in their hands. He was the first statesman since the Restoration who set the example of a purely public spirit. Keen as was his love of power, no man ever refused office so often, or accepted it with so strict a regard to the principles he professed. "I will not go to court," he replied to an offer which was made him, "if I may not bring the Constitution with me." For the corruption about him he had nothing but disdain. He left to Newcastle the buying of seats and the purchase of members. At the outset of his career, Pelham appointed him to the most lucrative office in his administration, that of paymaster of the forces, but its profits were of an illicit kind, and poor as he was, Pitt refused to accept 1 farthing beyond his salary. His pride never appeared in loftier and nobler form than in his attitudes toward the people at large. No leader had ever a wider popularity than the great commoner, as Pitt was styled, but his air was always that of a man who commands popularity, not that of one who seeks it. He never bent to flatter popular prejudice. When mobs were roaring themselves hoarse for Wilkes and liberty, he denounced Wilkes as a worthless profligate, and when all England went mad in its hatred of the Scots, Pitt haughtily declared his esteem for a people whose courage he had been the first to enlist on the side of loyalty. His noble figure, the hawk-like eye, which flashed from the small thin face, his majestic voice, the fire and grandeur of his eloquence, gave him a sway over the House of Commons far greater than any other minister has possessed. He could silence an opponent with a look of scorn, or hush the whole House with a single word. But he never stooped to the arts by which men form a political party, and at the height of his power, his personal following hardly numbered half a dozen members. His real strength, indeed, lay not in Parliament, but in the people at large. His title of the Great Commoner marks a political revolution. It is the people who have sent me here, Pitt boasted with a haughty pride when the nobles of the cabinet opposed his will. He was the first to see that the long political inactivity of the public mind had ceased, and that the progress of commerce and industry had produced a great middle class, which no longer found its representatives in the legislature. "You have taught me," said George II when Pitt sought to save Byng by appealing to the sentiment of Parliament, "to look for the voice of my people in other places than within the House of Commons." It was this unrepresented class which had forced him into power. During his struggle with Newcastle, the greater towns backed him with the gift of their freedom and addresses of confidence. "For weeks," laughs Horace Walpole, "it rained gold boxes." London stood by him through good report and evil report, and the wealthiest of English merchants, Alderman Beckford, was proud to figure as his political lieutenant. The temper of Pitt indeed harmonized admirably with the temper of the commercial England which rallied round him, with its energy, its self-confidence, its pride, its patriotism, its honesty, its moral earnestness. The merchant and the trader were drawn by a natural attraction to the one statesman of their time whose aims were unselfish, whose hands were clean, whose life was pure and full of tender affection for wife and child. But there was a far deeper ground for their enthusiastic reverence, and for the reverence which his country has borne Pitt ever since. He loved England with an intense and personal love. He believed in her power, her glory, her public virtue, till England learned to believe in herself. Her triumphs were his triumphs, her defeats his defeats. Her dangers lifted him high above all thought of self or party spirit. "Be one people," he cried to the factions who rose to bring about his fall. "Forget everything but the public. I set you the example." His glowing patriotism was the real spell by which he held England. But even the faults which checkered his character told for him with the middle classes. The Whig statesmen who preceded him had been men whose pride expressed itself in a marked simplicity and absence of pretense. Pitt was essentially an actor, dramatic in the cabinet, in the House, in his very office. He transacted business with his clerks in full dress. His letters to his family, genuine as his love for them was, are stilted and unnatural in tone. It was easy for the wits of his day to jest at his affectation, his pompous gait, the dramatic appearance which he made on great debates, with his limbs swathed in flannel and his crutch by his side. Early in life, Walpole sneered at him for bringing into the House of Commons the gestures and emotions of the stage. But the classes to whom Pitt appealed were classes not easily offended by faults of taste, and saw nothing to laugh at in the statesman who was borne into the lobby amidst the torches of the gout, or carried into the House of Lords to breathe his last in a protest against national dishonor. Above all, Pitt wielded the strength of resistless eloquence. The power of political speech had been revealed in the stormy debates of the Long Parliament, but it was cramped in its utterance by the legal and theological pedantry of the time. Pedantry was flung off by the age of the Revolution, but in the eloquence of Somers and his rivals we see ability rather than genius, knowledge, clearness of expression, precision of thought, the lucidity of the pleader or the man of business, rather than the passion of the orator. Of this clearness of statement, Pitt had little or none. He was no ready debater like Walpole, no speaker of set speeches like Chesterfield. His set speeches were always his worst, for in these his want of taste, his love of effect, His trite quotations and extravagant metaphors came at once to the front. That with defects like these he stood far above every orator of his time was due, above all, to his profound conviction, to the earnestness and sincerity with which he spoke. "I must sit still," he whispered once to a friend, "for when once I am up, everything that is in my mind comes out." But the reality of his eloquence was transfigured by a large and poetic imagination, an imagination so strong that, as he said himself, most things returned to him with stronger force the second time than the first, and by a glow of passion which not only raised him high above the men of his own day, but set him in the front rank among the orators of the world. The cool reasoning, the wit, the common sense of his age made way for a splendid audacity, a sympathy with popular emotion, a sustained grandeur, a lofty vehemence, a command over the whole range of human feeling. He passed without an effort from the most solemn appeal to the gayest raillery, from the keenest sarcasm to the tenderest pathos. Every word was driven home by the grand self-consciousness of the speaker. He spoke always as one having authority. He was in fact the first English orator whose words were a power not over Parliament only, but over the nation at large. Parliamentary reporting was as yet unknown, and it was only in detached phrases and half-remembered outbursts that the voice of Pitt reached beyond the walls of St. Stephen's. But it was especially in these sudden outbursts of inspiration, in these brief passionate appeals, that the might of his eloquence lay. The few broken words we have of him stirred the same thrill in men of our day which they stirred in the men of his own. Attempt on the 5 members, preparations for war. From History of the English People. The brawls of the 2 parties who gave each other the nicknames of Roundheads and Cavaliers created fresh alarm in the Parliament, but Charles persisted in refusing it a guard. On the honor of a king, he engaged to defend them from violence as completely as his own children. But the answer had hardly been given when his attorney appeared at the bar of the Lords and accused Hampden, Pym, Hollis, Strode, and Haselrig of high treason in their correspondence with the Scots. A herald at arms appeared at the bar of the Commons and demanded the surrender of the 5 members. If Charles believed himself to be within legal forms, the Commons saw a mere act of arbitrary violence in a charge which proceeded personally from the king, which set aside the most cherished privileges of Parliament and summoned the accused before a tribunal which had no pretext to a jurisdiction over them. The Commons simply promised to take the demand into consideration, and again requested a guard. "I will reply tomorrow," said the king. On the morrow he summoned the gentlemen who clustered round Whitehall to follow him, and embracing the Queen, promised her that in an hour he would return master of his kingdom. A mob of cavaliers joined him as they left the palace, and remained in Westminster Hall as Charles, accompanied by his nephew, the Elector Palatine, entered the House of Commons. "Mr. Speaker," he said, "I must for a time borrow your chair." He paused with a sudden confusion as his eye fell on the vacant spot where Pym commonly sat. For, at the news of his approach, the House had ordered the 5 members to withdraw. "Gentlemen," he began in a slow, broken sentence, "I am sorry for this occasion of coming unto you. Yesterday I sent a sergeant-at-arms upon a very important occasion to apprehend some that by my command were accused of high treason, whereunto I did expect obedience and not a message. Treason," he went on, "had no privilege, and therefore I am come to know if any of these persons that were accused are here." There was a dead silence, only broken by his reiterated, "I must have them wheresoever I find them." He again paused, but the stillness was unbroken. Then he called out, "Is Mr. Pym here?" There was no answer, and Charles, turning to the speaker, asked him whether the 5 members were there. Lenthal fell on his knees. I have neither eyes to see, he replied, nor tongue to speak in this place. But as this house is pleased to direct me. Well, well, Charles angrily retorted, 'tis no matter. I think my eyes are as good as another's. There was another long pause while he looked carefully over the ranks of members. I see, he said at last, all the birds are flown. I do expect you will send them to me as soon as they return hither. If they did not, he added, he would seek them himself, and with a closing protest that he never intended any force, he went out of the house, says an eyewitness, in a more discontented and angry passion than he came in. Nothing but the absence of the 5 members and the calm dignity of the Commons had prevented the king's outrage from ending in bloodshed. 500 gentlemen of the best blood in England would hardly have stood tamely by while the bravos of Whitehall laid hands on their leaders in the midst of the Parliament. The 5 members had taken refuge in the city, and it was there that on the next day the king himself demanded their surrender from the aldermen at Guildhall. Cries of privilege rang round him as he returned through the streets. The writs issued for the arrest of the 5 were disregarded by the sheriffs, and a proclamation issued 4 days later declaring them traitors passed without notice. Terror drove the Cavaliers from Whitehall, and Charles stood absolutely alone, for the outrage had severed him for the moment from his new friends in the Parliament and from the ministers, Falkland and Culpeper, whom he had chosen among them. But lonely as he was, Charles had resolved on war. The Earl of Newcastle was dispatched to muster a royal force in the north, and on the 10th of January, news that the 5 members were about to return in triumph to Westminster drove Charles from Whitehall. He retired to Hampton Court and to Windsor, while the trained bands of London and Southwark on foot and the London watermen on the river all sworn to guard the Parliament, the kingdom, and the king, escorted Pym and his fellow members along the Thames to the House of Commons. Both sides prepared for the coming struggle. The Queen sailed from Dover with the crown jewels to buy munitions of war. The Cavaliers again gathered round the king, and the royalist press flooded the country with states papers, drawn up by Hyde. On the other hand, the Commons resolved by vote to secure the great arsenals of the kingdom, Hull, Portsmouth, and the Tower, while mounted processions of freeholders from Buckinghamshire and Kent traversed London on their way to St. Stephen's, vowing to live and die with the Parliament. The great point, however, was to secure armed support from the nation at large, and here both sides were in a difficulty. Previous to the innovations introduced by the Tudors, and which had been already questioned by the Commons in a debate on pressing soldiers, the king in himself had no power of calling on his subjects generally to bear arms, save for purposes of restoring order or meeting foreign invasion. On the other hand, no one contended that such a power had ever been exercised by the 2 houses without the king, and Charles steadily refused to consent to a militia bill, in which the command of the national force was given in every county to men devoted to the parliamentary cause. Both parties therefore broke through constitutional precedent, the Parliament in appointing the Lord Lieutenants who commanded the militia by ordinance of the 2 houses, Charles in levying forces by royal commissions of array. The king's great difficulty lay in procuring arms, and on the 23rd of April he suddenly appeared before Hull, the magazine of the North, and demanded admission. The new governor, Sir John Hotham, fell on his knees but refused to open the gates, and the avowal of his act by the Parliament was followed by the withdrawal of the Royalist party among its members from their seats at Westminster. The 2 houses gained in unity and vigor by the withdrawal of the Royalists. The militia was rapidly enrolled. Lord Warwick named to the command of the fleet, and a loan opened in the city, to which the women brought even their wedding rings. The tone of the 2 houses had risen with the threat of force, and their last proposals demanded the powers of appointing and dismissing the royal ministers, naming guardians for the royal children, and of virtually controlling military, civil, and religious affairs. If I granted your demands, replied Charles, I should be no more than the mere phantom of a king.